He left the splendor of heaven, knowing his destiny was the lonely hill of Golgotha, there to lay down his life for me. If that isn't love, the ocean is dry, there's no stars in the sky, and the sparrow can't fly. If that isn't love, then heaven's a myth. There's no feeling like this. If that isn't love, even in death he remembered the thief hanging by his side. He spoke with love and compassion. Then he promised him paradise. If that isn't love, the ocean is dry, there's no stars in the sky, and the sparrow can't fly. If that isn't love, then heaven's a myth. There's no feeling like this. If that isn't love, there's no feeling like this. If that isn't love.
Good morning. I want to say thank you for that song. Wasn't that beautiful? And you know what? He couldn't have picked a better one for my sermon. So he just must have known what I was going to talk about today. So I want to let you know that this past week, just to let you in on a few secrets of my life here, this past week I went to Edmonton to attend various doctors' things that I go to every 6 months. It's called the Movement Disorder Clinic, and you go there and they find out how your brain is reacting to muscles and different things. And so I was there this time, and I was kind of dreading it because I want to let you know that I'm developing a quick hatred for physiotherapists. What they send you through is unbelievable. And she sits there across from me this time, and she says, "I'm really disappointed in you." And I felt like grade 2, You're sitting there, and she said, "I'm really disappointed in you." Why? She says, "You tell me every time you're going to walk, you're going to get healthy, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And then we go for a walk, and you're under the times there you should be doing it." And I feel like, well, I was doing that because I was waiting for you, to catch up. But they asked me, they said, "Do you have a lot of stress in your life?" And I said, "Well, let me think." And they said, "Because we think cognitively you might have slipped a little." Now, how do you like being told that by your doctor? And I said, "Well, my wife could have told you that." I didn't have to come to Edmonton to hear that. And then he says, well, what happened was they asked about stress. And I got thinking, let's see, I thought stress in my life. Let's see what's happening. How many of you have ever had stress in your life? Oh, well, okay, then I can talk freely here. Because our daughter, as most of you know, has moved in with us for a while her house is being readied that she's going to move into in the country. And she moved in with 4 kids. So believe it or not, we have 7 people in our house. 7 people in our little house that used to just be my wife and I. 7 people. And then she asked me if she could have a cat. And so I said, because Jenna's always big into animals and stuff, she wanted to have a cat. So I said, okay, but it has to go with you when you go, and just 1 cat. Well, the cat got pregnant. So just the other day it had kittens, so we have 7 kittens in the house, 7 cats now. So I have 7 people, 7 cats, and our dog just had puppies. And so, believe it or not, we have 7 dogs. And as my granddaughter said, reminded me the other day, we also have 7 fish in the house. So I'm liking the word 7 here, but last night when I got home from Edmonton, Cassidy said to me that we only have 6 fish now. And I thought, oh, what happened? She says, name one of them, I don't know what, Goldie. Goldie is living in the toilet now. So I said, you think I have stress? I feel like I'm Noah. And so it was an interesting thing, and learning about stress. But I know they just have my goodness at heart, and so I have to go back in July, and she says I better see results. So I'll have to let her see results now that I've told you this. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk with you this morning. I think I have a message that when I heard it, I was astounded by it. And a fellow, when I was in Union College, a fellow got up and preached a sermon about Judas. And I'd always had some ideas about Judas. And you never think good thoughts about Judas, do you? Judas isn't that person who he has good thoughts up on, so today I'm going to talk to you about 2 men. In the bulletin it said T0 or TO, but I'm talking TWO, okay? So 2 men and a Savior. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Judas, and we're going to contrast his life with that of Peter, okay? And we're going to background it at the crucifixion. So I'm wondering, when you talk about Judas, now please don't be afraid to talk up, okay? But when you talk about Judas, what are some thoughts that come to your mind, some names? Dishonest? What's another one? Traitor. Traitor, dishonest. Sorry? Thief. Wow, we're really getting in there. Okay. He betrayed Jesus. So not a lot of good thoughts come in, and there's not a lot of good ideas. But I was very wrong when I found out what Desire of Ages really has to say about Judas. I was quite wrong with a lot of my thoughts. How about Peter? What do you think of when you think of Peter?
He had a short fuse or had temper.
Short fuse, temper? Crazy?
Courageous.
Oh, courageous and outspoken. Always got his foot in his mouth. Yeah, all those. So they're very different in what words we think of them. But actually, I hope to show you today that they're very, very similar. Very similar in what happened to them. Not so much in their personalities, but in what happened to them. It was a strange group of people. I'll give you a little background here. It was a strange group of people who made their way through the darkening streets of Jerusalem that night. They were a noisy group with lots of clatter, lots of laughing. The clatter of armor from the Roman soldiers within the group added to the noise. The group swelled as some of the homeless people at night joined the group, just out of curiosity. As it made its way through the streets of Jerusalem, the crowd continued to swell, more out of curiosity than purpose. It was Passover time in Jerusalem, and people by the thousands had begun to make their way into the city for the yearly event. And if you were close enough to get a close inspection of this group, it would lead you to a few surprises. It would lead a few surprises, and one in particular is the man who seems to be leading the group. He is a tall man, a distinguished-looking man, a man of learning, a man of class, a man who is wearing the garments of the high priest of Israel. The question this morning is, what is the high priest of Israel doing walking through the streets of Jerusalem with street people and Roman soldiers at this time of night, or really at any time of day or night? They now come to the eastern gate, where a guard is stationed. The gate is never closed during Passover. He is curious, he looks at them, but he does not want to stop them. He had seen another group of about a dozen men who had gone through the same gate a few hours earlier, a much quieter group. Now the leader, Caiaphas, and the soldiers move with the group down over the Kidron, and they begin to ascend the Mount of Olives. They make a turn, and they enter into the garden. And suddenly, as if on cue, there is a sudden change in the leadership of the group. And another tall, noble-looking gentleman takes the lead of the group. Meanwhile, Jesus hears them coming. He has been laying prostrate on the ground, praying to his Father, for he does not know what lies ahead of him. And in the midst of these agonizing prayers, Jesus hears the noise of the coming crowd. He rises, and walking over to his still sleeping disciples, he says only, "Sleep on now, for the hour has come." And then the crowd is upon them. Can you imagine going up with Jesus to pray and falling asleep? Falling asleep, his best friends, while he agonized there. The crowd is in the garden, but instead of taking Jesus at once, they pause, for there is one important act that must take place before anyone is to lay hands on Jesus. And it is for this reason now that they stay back in the dark shadows of the trees. Now stepping forward out of the shadows comes a very familiar face to Jesus. Someone who he has eaten with, he has slept along the road with, someone who he has laid hands of ordination on, someone who walked and talked with him, who witnessed his miracles, and Jesus himself had given him the power to perform miracles. This figure now approaches Jesus, and he begins to pretend that he is actually regretting what he is about to do. He actually feigns tears, and coming over to Jesus, he takes him in his arms, and he begins to kiss him, not once, but repeatedly. Jesus now looks into the face of Judas, and he says, "Judas, did you have to do it this way?" He now steps back, and the guards now take Jesus and bind his hands with the word securely stressed for all to hear. Rather strange behavior from someone who is betraying a friend. If you were to betray a friend, I'm not sure you would do it the way Judas did. Would you follow the group to where the person was? Would you come forward and start kissing the person or hugging them or saying you love them, and yet you're there to betray them? It's rather interesting what happened. But to come forward so boldly and directly, you see Judas act in such a way, and this is important because Judas had absolutely no intention that Jesus would have to die that night. Judas never dreamed in all of his scheming that it would go as far as it did, for Judas in the back of his mind really believed that Jesus was who he said he was. The problem was that Jesus did just not go about things the right way. In Judas' eyes, Jesus was a poor politician. He didn't make the right mix of friends. He alienated the wrong people. He just seemed to bumble it over and over again, Judas thought. Judas figured that Jesus should be on the throne. And he felt that every time a situation arose to put him there, well, Jesus just seemed to blow it. The feeding of the 5,000 was a tremendous occasion. Up to 40,000 people fed physically and spiritually. When it was all over, Judas was so excited. The movement had begun, and Jesus very soon would be their king and ruler, he thought. The people were excited too, and they began to spread the word that Jesus was about to seize power and sit on the throne of David. And Judas, well, guess who had helped bring it about? And you can follow this in Desire of Ages, page 378, if you want to have some reading this afternoon. But Judas observes that Jesus is resisting the mood of the crowd. And a pen of inspiration tells us that Judas actually went among the disciples to spread the idea that they should take Jesus by force and physically place him on the throne. Take him by force and physically place him there. Jesus is well aware of what is going on, and turning to his disciples with the crowd getting out of hand, he says directly to his disciples, "Get out of here into those boats and across the lake. I will meet you in Capernaum." And we're told this is the first time where we are shown that Jesus had ever spoke so firmly to his disciples. He says, "You go away and let me handle the crowd." The disciples do push off into the lake that evening, and instead of obeying Jesus, they go some short ways out into the lake, and there in the boat they sit, grumbling and complaining about what had just happened. Here they had just witnessed an event where up to 40,000 people were fed spiritually and physically, fed from the hand of God, a day where the pen of inspiration says that it seemed that heaven had come down to earth. A tremendous occasion, and just a few hours later, these men were sitting in the middle of the lake, complaining because their plans had been put on hold so suddenly. It's a good thing Jesus is in charge. I'm not sure how I would have handled the situation. I think possibly I would have 12 new men with me the next time over something like that. Think upon it for a little bit. How is it possible to go from seeing a miracle to complaining in the midst of the water in a boat? How is it possible that God can move and you watch his movement, and you watch what happens, and you watch the miracle happen? Day after day with Jesus, they watched miracles happen, and yet here they are in the boat complaining. Sounds familiar though, doesn't it? In a strange way, it sounds very familiar. Have you witnessed the hand of God guiding your steps in life and lost that connection? Has spiritual victories given way to dark chasms of grief and despair? Is there some reason today that you find yourself sitting lost in the middle of the lake, complaining? Today, if you are sitting in the middle of the lake with no shore in sight, I beg of you not to give up. Don't give up. It's not time for that. Please do not just sit in there, but give the oars to Jesus, and he will bring your boat in. Jesus does disperse the crowds that evening, and we are told that he went up to the side of a hill for meditation and prayer. And even though it was quite dark, Jesus kept watch over the men in the boat out in the middle of the lake. And it was this night that we read about in our scripture reading that a horrible storm came up. A horrible storm came up, and these strong fishermen fight a battle they cannot win. The waves begin to roll over the boat, and they frantically begin to bail water. And suddenly they look up and they see something strange coming to them across the water, and they are convinced that the grim reaper is coming to escort them home. The disciples had caused more than a physical storm, and Jesus knew that there was a painful inner storm raging as well. You know, it's very comforting to read the statement that Mrs. White has in Desire of Ages that states, even though they were complaining and grumbling, never once were they out of his sight. Never once were they out of his sight. And you know, no matter where you are in your boat, no matter how far offshore you are, no matter how lost you feel, Jesus is never losing sight of you as well. And he will keep looking for you. He loved those men so much. Judas was disappointed when Jesus turned away the rich young ruler. He felt for sure Jesus would have made some sort of accommodation to such a man. He was sure Jesus would have made an accommodation, a man of influential contacts, a man of substance, and for Jesus to be so rigid with him. It was so disappointing to Judas. And we were told that Judas actually made his first contact with the Pharisees the night that Mary had anointed Jesus' feet with an alabaster box. He began to complain as the cost of such a gift, and Jesus had looked him square in the eye and singling him out said, "Leave her alone." It was as firm as Jesus had ever been with him. And Judas had left there determined to get his revenge that day. His revenge, though, was not a cross. His revenge was not death, but a throne. And when they sat down to see all the circumstances that had got him there, they would look at his work and manipulation and say, you know what? He made it all possible. His revenge was to get them all to realize how smart he really was. He had no fear that Jesus would be crucified this night. Why, he had been there when they wanted to stone Jesus. And he had disappeared in the midst of them. And what about the time in Nazareth where they wanted to throw him over a cliff? Jesus had disappeared. There was no problem here. Judas had determined that this night he is going to put Jesus in such a position in front of Caiaphas that Jesus would be forced to proclaim himself the Messiah and King. Jesus would be placed on the throne, and that he, Judas, would have a top position in the group. Judas disdained the other disciples when they would argue over who was the greatest. They constantly had arguments over which of them would be sit next to Jesus in the kingdom and probably sit with him here on earth as well. Jesus, he knew that when it really counted, the cream would rise to the top, and it's for this reason that he emerges from the shadows and he kisses Jesus profusely. Have you ever thought that? This is the reason why he came out and started kissing Jesus. It was because Jesus must not forget Judas and his presence that night. It is also for this reason that Judas told the guards to securely tie Jesus, for he knew that when Jesus broke free, he, Judas, would be a part of the celebration. He thought he had covered all his bases. It's about now that the disciples wake up and begin seeing what is happening around them. And Peter, the other member of our story, Peter, I think somebody said he was courageous. Peter being courageous. From somewhere, who knows where, he happened to grab a sword. He has promised his Lord that night that he would die for him, and Peter will do it if he has to. Peter is no coward, and he means business, and he goes up into the crowd, and he knows how to use his sword. And Malchus looks up just in time to see the blade gleam in the moonlight, and he dodges to the side just as the blade slices past his ear, cutting it clean off. Cut his ear clean off. He cried out in pain, and one can see him grabbing the side of his head with blood gushing between his fingers, and suddenly there is Jesus as he bends over, picks up the ear, and puts it back on. Now, there are two people right now I would like to probe their minds. One of them is Malchus. He had come there to kill Jesus, to have Jesus killed. Now what do? Someone had sliced off your ear, and he had picked it up and put it back on him. What do? Do you continue? Do you turn around and leave? What do? Do you still have the same desire? And I'd also like to talk to the soldier who tied Jesus very securely. Judas is elated as the bounds of the tie were broken. And you could hear just think of the Roman guard saying, I've never had anybody get out of that one before. But he did. Wouldn't it be nice to talk to these people and see what was going through their head? Judas thought Jesus would wait until Jerusalem before freeing himself, but already he was doing it. And I can imagine a picture of Judas. Everything is a spectacular success for him. Except the soldier grabs Jesus again and reties him. Now Jesus is taken away, and his disciples, not knowing what to do, look around. And it's interesting that after Jesus had told Peter to put away his sword, it's Peter who says to the group, "Let's get out of here." And they scatter in all different directions. This is not the only time Peter will run this evening. Jesus is dragged out of the garden, across the Kidron, and through the streets. And interesting enough, he is taken to the home of Annas, not the high priest, but the ex-high priest. Now, have you ever wondered about this? What do you know about the high priest position in Israel? It was something that you had for how long? Does anybody know? For life. It was yours for life if you were the high priest. Now he's the ex-high priest. So he was taken to the home of the ex-high priest. Historians tell us that the position of the high priest at this time had ceased to be a religious position, but had become a political position. A position of greed, and it had become corrupt with power and great financial gain. After a person had been a high priest for a certain amount of time, and he did not get out of the way, well, they just would assassinate him. There was a list of assassinated high priests. In fact, one historian records that a high priest was actually drowned in the laver in the courtyard. Annas, he knew when and the time was right to retire, and even though he was done, he was a very influential person. And when he stepped aside, his son took over. And when he ran out of sons, he started on his son-in-law. And now Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas, is now the high priest. But it's still the old man who's running the show. Jesus is now brought to him this evening. And interesting enough, we are told that Annas is one of the chief people involved in the commerce trade that had been going on in the temple. And Jesus had now twice cleansed the temple. He had struck hard at the most precious thing Annas had, his pocketbook, and he is determined that night for revenge. Jesus is brought before him. He will not answer the accusations. Annas says, "What have you been saying in secret?" And Jesus' only answer is, "You had men following me, being spies for several years. Why don't you ask them?" The temple guard reaches out and slaps Jesus across the face and says, "Don't you speak to the high priest this way." Jesus was talking to Annas, not the high priest. Meanwhile, outside, the disciples have now found themselves, and Peter and John get together and they decide to go into the city to find Jesus. It is no trouble to find the place. Just look for the crowds. Just follow the noisy crowd. Peter and John hide in the shadows within sight of the gate where Jesus is. And someone comes and knocks on the door, and John recognizes that there's a woman keeping the gate who he knows. And he arranges with Peter to see if they can get in. They knock on the door, and the lady answers and recognizes John, and she does not let him in right away. But it's interesting, she goes to another authority higher up and asks, his disciples are here, 2 of his disciples, should we let them in? And the answer is given yes, because it is at this night that they want to so discourage the disciples that they would give up and not be following their leader, that they would give up their faith. The crowd is now extensive inside. Peter wants to remain anonymous, so he mixes with the crowds. John moves across the courtyard, finds a spot by Jesus, settles in to watch. Sounds like John, doesn't it? John, the one, what does it say? John, the disciple whom Jesus loved? Sounds very much like John. One doesn't seem concerned with being recognized. The other is afraid to be recognized. We do not want to forget the fact that there is one other disciple in the courtyard that night. There are 3 of them, and it's interesting to note what happened to two of them. Judas is becoming a bit concerned. Judas watches someone put a bag over Jesus' head and slap him, saying, "Hey, oh great prophet, who hit you? Guess who hit you?" He sees someone clear his throat roll it around and spit on Jesus' face. He sees someone reach up and take a handful of beard and yank it out and pulled it all out. And Judas sees that now Jesus is very serious and is not going to free himself. And as time goes by, Judas becomes more and more upset. And he begins to realize that Jesus is going to die. And unfortunately, he, Judas, will be responsible for it. Great beads of sweat began running down his forehead and onto his face. And finally, unable to contain himself any longer, he rushed into the midst of it all. He threw the money down and he cries out, "Let him go. You must let him go. He has done nothing wrong." Caiaphas did not expect this at all. He was a bit taken back, and we are told that he hated Judas as well. Getting nowhere, Judas now turns to Jesus, and falling at his feet, he must have grabbed at his legs and he begins to sob. And he cries out, "Lord, you can get out of here. Lord, I know you can. I saw you disappear when they want to stone you. I saw you disappear when they want to throw you over a cliff. Please, Lord, let's get out of here." And Jesus looks at him with no animosity, just a tremendous amount of compassion and pity. And he says, "Judas, I tried to tell you, and you would not listen. This is why I have come into this world." Judas jumps to his feet and he begins to scream, "It is too late, it is too late." And he bursts from the courtyard and he begins to run out through the courtyard and into the streets. And we are told that as he ran, he found a rope from somewhere. He cannot bear to wait until morning. He cannot bear to live until morning. And I wonder if somewhere Judas's heart, he really did love Jesus. He could not bear to see what was about to happen, and going outside the city wall, he sees a tree hanging over a cliff, and throwing a rope over the edge, he ties it around his neck and flings himself out over the cliff. We are told that Judas was a rather large man, and that the rope he had chosen was not strong enough. And as he jumped out, the rope broke, and his body fell down on the rocks below, splitting open for the dogs who fed on the garbage now find his body. He cannot bear to the point where Judas had to die. He could not bear with what he had done to Jesus. Meanwhile, back in the courtyard is another disciple trying to remain anonymous. Already he had been identified at one fire, and he said, "No, not me, I do not know him. You must be thinking of someone else." And on onto the other fire, the same thing happened, and finally to a third fire, it happened again. And someone saw him and explained, "I know you. You are part of his group." And would you believe that one of the reasons he is identified in the first place was that after this trying to hide his identity, he actually participated in mocking Jesus. Peter did. When people in the crowd were jeering and slapping their fists and shaking their fists, he actually started jeering and shaking his fist. Jesus, who had saved him from drowning just a little while before. Jesus, who he had said he would die for, and he is identified for the second time because there is something wrong with his jeering. As he is shaking his fist and yelling names at Jesus, great drops of tears began to flow from his eyes. He is not a good actor. In fact, he is quite a poor actor. And it is now quite evident whose side he is on. And now to hide that, he begins to curse at Jesus. And those words he had learned as a fisherman on the seas began to flow out. And it was then that he heard the rooster crow. Oh, he had heard it for the first time, but it had not registered with him. But now the warning words of Jesus came back to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me thrice." This time he turned around and focusing in on where he had last saw Jesus, who had also heard the rooster crow. These two men stood there looking at one another. And all Peter could see is sorrow, compassion, and pity, and he turns away. He cannot bear to look into that face and see those eyes who read him like a book. And as he stares into the fire, all of the great things, all of the good things Jesus had done for him over the past 3 years now race through his mind. Looking back now at Jesus, he sees a hand reach out and slap him across the face. And he knows that he has hurt Jesus far more than that slap ever could. He cannot bear feeling this way. And so within just a short time, another disciple bursts through the courtyard, crying, and he races through the streets crying. He is just crying and running, running and running. Out of the eastern gates he goes, and he now finds himself back in the garden. He finds the marks in the ground where the mob had been. Further on, he finds the marks in the sand and the soil where Jesus had already shed his blood. The fingernail marks where Jesus had grabbed the earth as he prayed. Peter, in agony, falls down on this spot and he cries, "Oh God, let me die. Oh God, I am not fit to even live." And that night, after 3.5 years of seeing miracles after miracles, 3.5 years of having one-to-one conversation with Jesus, that night, the real Peter did die. God did answer his prayer. And that night, Peter, after 3.5 years of walking with Jesus, was converted. This tells me why we should not judge others. It would have been easy to judge Peter that he was, swearing at Jesus and he'd gone away and he'd run down the streets and stuff. Sometimes we like to judge other people. But whether you have a family member who is not in the church today, or somebody who is on your heart, never give up praying. Just keep on praying. Because there's nothing else you can do. God is the one who can move on that person's heart. And you need to pray, and pray like you've never have before, because the end is coming soon. And now, where the walk with Jesus is at, and it's unfair to me to judge others. I don't want to look at others and look at Peter's guilt. Look only to Christ and his stretched out arm. As I think of Judas and Peter, I do not see a lot of difference between the two of them. When I really look at Judas, I see not much difference between himself and even myself. Judas was not a wicked man, just an individual who thought he was smart enough to run his own life. He was never really willing to surrender and let Jesus run his life. He somehow felt he could stay with the crowd, stay on the fence, stay on that line, and keep his own life going. I think Judas is typified by a person who wants to do his own thing, never willing to make a complete surrender, just kind of partially. But Jesus runs his life for him. I want to say to you this morning that Jesus has to control our lives. And that is the reason that Peter failed. He tried to run his own life. What scares me is that I often am the same way. I want to be in control, master of my destiny. I drive the ship. I can be a Christian, but I will do it my way. Somewhere, and if you forget everything I have said today, but remember this one thing. But remember only this sentence. I will be happy. Somewhere along the line, we need to move over and let Jesus run our lives. Sometimes we have to gather enough faith in Jesus that we are willing to make that complete surrender and let him guide our lives and trust him, really trust him, to take us to the very best place it is possible for you to be. We need that kind of faith in Jesus if we are not to be like Judas. I need to have the faith to trust my life to Jesus. Sometimes I forget that he is in control. Sometimes I maybe choose not to think that, but he is. And he wants to control our lives as well. Not control it in a bad way, but to help us make it into the kingdom. This morning before you, I want to say that I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe he heals broken lives. I believe he can heal anyone's sin and brokenness here this morning. I believe that if you let him, that he will take you home with him, and he's ready to do that. He forgives sins, and I believe he laughs with me, he feels my sorrow, and is always beside me. Please won't you say with me that we believe in Jesus Christ. Two men, two different stories. It would take a week of sermons to go over everything about those two men. But two men, two different stories. Both of them died that night. Judas committed suicide, and I'm not really sure if I'm ready to give up on Judas being in heaven at all. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure what went through his mind. He killed himself. Why? Because he could not bear to think of what he had caused Jesus. I'm sure that somewhere in his heart there must have been a little room for forgiveness. And you know, Peter died too. Peter died to the old self. And Peter became new in Jesus. And he became one of the greatest disciples of all time. I believe in Jesus Christ, and I believe he will heal us today. Thank you.
You please join me for